Let's cross-process a file in the Camera Raw editor, and we can do that by opening Cross-Process Before, and that will open up in the ACR, the Adobe Camera Raw editor. And then you can click here to rotate the shot and make it the right way up. And the next thing to do is to have a look at the exposure, because cross-process shots have a very high contrast, but here the highlights are actually petering out far from the far right there where they should be at their brightest. But we can push them along to the right by dragging exposure to the right like so, and then our highlights are peaking up near the right. If we go too far, you start to get clipping if you've turned on the highlight clipping warning at the top there. So let's take it down to about 2.45. We've opened up the stops, nearly 2, almost 3 stops in fact, using the exposure slider. So now we're all midtones and highlights, but there's not much shadow detail, so let's boost the shadows by dragging blacks to the right to around about a very strong 26, and that gives us the harsh black underexposed shadows that you get with cross-processed images. If you press U for underexposed, you can see we've clipped these areas. They're going to print out as pure black with no detail, but that's fine because that's the kind of exaggerated contrast you get with cross-processing. We can also increase contrast by pushing the contrast slider up to around about 48 or so, just to get a little bit more darker detail there. And then let's pop the vibrance slider up to around about plus 29, and that increases the color strength of weaker colors while leaving stronger colors untouched. Now you can see these clipping warnings giving us a bit of a distraction, so press O to get rid of the overexposed red ones and U to get rid of the blue patches. And you can see now we've got a really high contrast and a very striking shot, but the cross-processed colors aren't quite right. You'd expect them a more greeny blue there and a bit of a magenta hue perhaps in the shadows, and we can achieve that using the split toning tab. And you can find that by popping up to here and clicking like so. Now the highlights, you can see, are fairly blue, and we can get a nice greeny blue by tweaking the highlights by changing these particular sliders. So let's go to hue and set that to around about 116, and let's set the saturation to a fairly strong 76, and that will give us much more vibrant and greenier looking blues, which is kind of typical of the cross-processed look. Now when people are mimicking the old school cross-processing technique, they tend to get a kind of magenta hue to the shadows, and we can do that of course by targeting the shadows and changing their hue and their saturation. So let's take the saturation to 47, and let's choose a magenta type hue of around about 323. So if I type that in there, you can also see the magentas up here as a little preview on this bar, and that gives you this really cool looking magenta hue in the shadows. We can then play with the balance between the shadows and the highlights by dragging this slider to the left, and that balances things more towards being biased to the shadow settings. So about minus 29 I think should do the trick. So there we have our nice magenta shadows, our greeny blue hue for the lighter highlights, and we've got a fairly typical cross-processed looking image now. And as a finishing touch, pop back to basics, and we can enhance this kind of warm magenta compared to the cool blue by warming up the shot a little bit and dragging the color temperature slider to the right to about 6050. Something like that should do the trick, or just type in the value for faster workflow. There you go, there's our finished shot. Now you may have other photographs that you want to cross-process, and you can actually save the settings that we've used both on the exposure setting, the vibrancy and the split toning by popping to this little flyout icon, and if you click here you can't quite see it because it's poking off the edge of the screen, but there's a save settings option just down here, and that brings up the save settings box. You can then choose things like all settings or just basic, and then you can tick extra things like split toning, click OK, and you're creating your custom subset which allows you to save one. Here's one I prepared earlier, it's called cross-processed look, and you can just click save, and then you can load that in later as it'll appear. If you go to load settings, you can then choose that, click open, and it will apply the settings instantly to any photograph that you open in the Camera Raw editor. So that's a much quicker way to apply all the cross-processing settings to future photographs.